All right, so, and now for something completely different, okay? So, what I will try to convince you of today, or hopefully just give you a glimpse, is the computational modeling approaches that have been coming along really since the last 10 years. Pretty much the whole effort to use computational neuroscience models to study the neuroscience of addiction has really developed in the last 10 years. And this is, I also should say that some of the work that I've done was when I was on a sabbatical in Krakow, so I put that down as well. Okay, so what we're really going to look at today in some ways is the mathematics of addiction, right? So who has training in mathematics here? Okay, all right. Okay, fine. Then I'm going to give you the simplified version, right? That basically is based on addition, subtraction, and division. Okay, all right. Okay, and so what I want to do is lay out this overly ambitious lecture plan, and hopefully we'll get through some parts of it at least. All right. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time to give you a glimpse at sort of like how can we view what the brain does, or certain circuits in the brain do, in terms of computations, okay? And then focus on laying giving you sort of a basis for what are the prevalent ways to model motivation-based behavior, okay? And then the last part of the first hour will be to give you a survey, kind of a historical survey of the major modeling classes that have been applied to addiction, okay? And then try to go through two examples. One example is our modeling effort on trying to understand how homeostasis and value-based decision-making and learning might interact. And the second one is a different level of modeling, and that's looking at circuit-level model in the ventral tegmental area and understanding how specific aspects of nicotinic receptor action may explain certain aspects of the data, electrophysiological data. Okay, all right. So we all know that the brain exists to cool the blood. That's been known for a long time. Okay, but let's put that aside. And if we think about what is the brain for, right? What's that thing in our head is for? It's very difficult to negate the fact that one of its major roles is to perform some kind of computation, operate somehow on the information that comes in order to generate what comes out, which is our behavior, right? And it could be normal behavior, abnormal behavior, addictive behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And David Marr in the 70s really sort of provided a very important and influential framework for thinking about the brain as a computational organ or a machine, where he suggested that there are at least three major levels of description or analysis that you may carry out, right? The computational level, where you ask the questions, what is the system doing, okay? All right? The algorithmic or representational level, where you go into the process that goes into doing what it does. How does the system actually do what it does? What are the operations that brain circuit might perform in order to implement its function? And then the last level, well, not last, but another more detailed level is the implementational level, and that's asking what are the specific mechanisms that actually happen in neural circuits, right? That give rise to the algorithms or the general computation, right? And then hopefully we'll go at least two levels of description: this algorithmic level and implementational level, right? Okay, so I want to give you a couple of examples before getting into even motivated decision-making, sort of a couple of examples of computation that you can see in the brain. And I'm going to do this real fast because I know that I have less time than I thought. All right? Okay? So I'll give you two examples of the brain processes that subserve computations. One is about decision making, right? Sort of how can we learn about what's going on in the brain when we're asking questions about how do you make decisions based on what you see, all right? And the other example is sort of how do these decision-making processes may be described from a dynamical point of view, not from an explicit algorithmic point of view. All right, and then go towards models of motivated decision-making. Okay. All right, so this is an example of a pretty famous experiment. It has nothing to do with addiction, but it has to do everything to do with decision-making. All right, and the experiment was the following. The monkey was sitting in front of a screen, and there was this stimulus that came on where there were random dots, or dots dots moving in random directions. Okay, and what was controlled in the experiment is the percentage of dots whose motion was biased to the left or to the right. Okay, so they were controlling uncertainty of the stimulus. And the job of the monkey was to look to the right when it thought that more dots were moving to the right, and look to the left when it thought more dots were moving to the left. Okay, and the question that was asked in Mike Shadlin's lab was, if you record now from individual neurons in the brain, what sort of computations could you see happening that could subserve this decision making? Okay, and in fact, when they recorded, so they recorded from a number of areas, and then when they recorded from LIP, I think lateral interparietal area, they saw that there were individual neurons whose activity, so here's a firing rate as a function of time, the stimulus comes on here, and what they saw is that there were some neurons that increased their firing rate when the motion was to the right and the monkey looked to the right, okay? And others decreased their firing rate when the motion was to the left. Decreased their firing rate when the motion was to the right. There we go. Okay? And so the question, and then when you look at the decision time, what happens, right? What they saw was that when the monkey looked to the right, these neurons that fired more, somehow stopped firing right at the decision time, okay? And so the idea was that these neurons are actually encoding the inferred motion of the stimulus, okay? And then the decision is made based on which population of neurons had sufficiently high firing rates, right? If it was the population of neurons that encodes the right, that hit some kind of a threshold, the monkey was inferring that the motion was to the right, and it looked to the right, okay? If, on the other hand, and the opposing population of neurons decreased its firing rate. If you flip the stimulus, right, and the neural activity actually flipped, so the neurons that preferred the left had the high firing rate, and the neurons that preferred the right had low firing rate, right, that signaled that the monkey inferred that the stimulus was to the left, and made the saccade to the left, all right? And I don't have time to show you all the slides, but when the monkey made mistakes, meaning that it looked to the left when the stimulus was to the right selective neurons actually had a decreased firing rate, okay? So from the activity of these neurons, you could decode the monkey's eventual decision, all right? And in fact, you could show that you could model this decision process with a simple equation, the drift diffusion model, right? Where what you modeled was dynamics in time of a variable that was driven by a ratio in the by a log ratio of the probabilities that you observed the firing rate of the neuron selective for the decision minus the firing rate that was anti-selective for the decision. Okay, so the simple model, right, sort of algorithmically described how this decision process is encoded in the brain, right? And so here comes an idea that neurons in the brain encode some information, right? They accumulate that information, meaning they perform a computation, all right? And then there is a decision, a binary computation that's done, and that is, I've reached my threshold, I'm going to make a decision to the left or to the right, okay?
Yeah. If you start your process with an observation like this one, is it important to you that whether this is correlative or has some causal elements in the experiment?
Of course it's important, okay? All right, and that's why I'm not going to show you all the line of research that came out of these initial experiments, right, where they turned this question every possible way. For example, they asked the question, if we focus on a firing rate of a single neuron, can we predict the decision that the monkey is doing, right? So what you do is you kind of like do a blind analysis, right? You say...
Sure, that's going to make your model better and better, but it's not going to get causal,
right? Okay,
right?
so now...
I mean, what you would have to have is a manipulation of the firing rate and then say...
And I believe they did it.
Yeah.
They did it, and they got the result that is expected from this model, right? And you can manipulate also the time that you allow this model to integrate, and that gives you changes in the certainty of decisions and the proportion of false positives and false negatives, right? And you actually see that in the statistics, okay? I don't have sort of time to go through this, but I just wanted to give us an example, right, of encoding of decision-making in the cortex and how you could describe it with a simple model, all right? So an alternative way, so look here. Basically, what this says is that this activity is sort of by itself, is independent from this activity, but then there is some other sort of process that takes the difference or the ratio between this activity and that activity, puts it into an integrator, and there's a decision that's made, okay? So in fact, this decision process is sort of extraneous to this circuit itself. But alternatively, what you can say is that, okay, let's consider this situation, all right? Let's imagine that what we have are populations of neurons that are selective, let's say, to the left, populations of neurons that are selective to the right, just like I showed you, right? And in fact, they interact with each other through a sort of a generalized cross-inhibition, right? So they compete, all right? Okay, and this was a nice paper from Xiaojing Wang's lab. You can do some mathemagic, right? You can start out with a model that's complicated like that and reduce it down to a model of two competing, essentially, firing rate equations, right? Where S1 now describes, let's say, the sort of the synaptic activity in population 1. S2 is the synaptic activity in population 2. They're both driven by firing rates, and the firing rates depend on the various inputs, which are cross-inhibition, self-excitation, and the input from the sensory periphery, right? And so when the motion is mostly to the right, this guy would be bigger than this, and vice versa, okay? And now you study the dynamics of this cross-competing model, okay? And what falls out of it, that's too technical, okay? But basically, this model forms a system with an energy landscape where you have two energy wells, so meaning two stable situations. And the two stable situations are when there is no stimulus, no decision is made, the system stays at its equilibrium. And when there is stimulus, this middle equilibrium disappears, and the system is now in a winner-take-all dynamics. And that means that one or the other population would outcompete, right, depending on, you know, which way the input pushes you. And so you go into one well or the other well, depending on the strength of the bias in the statistics of the stimulus towards one direction or another, okay? And when you simulate that sort of model, what you get is you get activity of these populations that really mimics the neural activity that you see in the LIP, okay? All right? And then, I don't have slides for that, but just with this kind of a population, you can, in fact, model the whole decision process, right? So that you don't need an outside accumulator from the LIP, that the LIP circuitry itself is sufficient to make this decision. And notice that this is not algorithmic, right? We didn't build into this model sort of thresholds or accumulation, et cetera, right? So it's just the dynamics, right, that perform this computation, and this computation is non-algorithmic, right? So very quickly, if we go back to David Marr's principles, right, of description, you know, functional, algorithmic, implementational, right? This particular style of modeling says that, you know, the algorithmic level of analysis, right, is not useful in a sense, right? It's not required, right? You get it from just the activity. Okay, let me see where I can jump. Okay, all right. And so you can take sort of both of these models, either the drift diffusion model of sensory decision making, or this sort of dynamic model of sensory decision making, and you can actually summarize how you make the selection of action to the right or to the left with basically one equation, right? Okay, and this one equation really says that, look, functionally, what happens is that the probability of action being to one side or another, let's say to the left, right, really equals to how much evidence that we have accumulated that the stimulus is going to the left, normalized by the evidence for it going to the left or to the right, okay? All right, notice that this is not 1, right, because it could be that nothing is going more to the left or to the right, okay? All right, okay? And then in the neural terms, you know, the evidence that things are going to the left could be signaled by activity of the left selective neurons, right, given that you show a stimulus, right? And this normalization term is the activity of both the left and the right selective neurons, okay? All right, and if you know anything about Bayesian statistics, basically this is sort of a poor man's version of the Bayes theorem, right, about how you make inferences. And later you will see that action selection and reinforcement learning models also follows this structure, okay? So now we've gone from kind of an algorithmic model, right, and a dynamic model, right, and we sort of come back to kind of a functional description model, right? Okay, all right. So now something a bit more relevant to this course, and that is if you think about the activity of dopamine neurons in the midbrain dopamine circuits, and you've seen this figure I don't know how many times in your career, and you will probably see it over and over and over again. You know, and as Christian was telling you yesterday at least, that, you know, when you don't expect a reward, you get increase in dopamine activity. When you expect a reward, you no longer get increase in dopamine activity at the time of the reward, but you get it at the CS, right? And if you omit the reward, you get a drop in the firing of these dopamine neurons, probably in substantia nigra, okay? And so what is going on here is really a computation, right? It's a mathematical operation that's being performed, and that is a subtraction between the reward that you get and the reward that you expect to get given the CS, right? Okay? So that, you know, when you don't expect a reward and you get it, this activity should be equal to the reward, right? When you expect it and you get it, this activity is 0. And then when you expect it but don't get it, right? Sorry, that shouldn't be 0, it should be -r. Whoops.
Math is difficult.
hey, I'm not, you know, I'm a mathematician, I'm not an accountant, right? So arithmetic is hard for me. Okay, all right, that was a woo-woo making slides late. Okay, all right. And so notice that there is an interesting, just out of thinking about this as a computation, right, there's already kind of like a little micro prediction that comes, right? That if you make this reward bigger, this activity should really scale with it, right? If that's what's being encoded, okay? And it just so happened that there was a recent paper in Nature Neuroscience where they did an experiment. I'm not going to go into all the details, but they did an experiment where they manipulated the amount of reward that the animal got, right? And they looked at the firing rate of dopamine neurons, and they saw that, in fact, indeed, this activity scales with the reward size, right? So somehow the circuitry of the dopaminergic nuclei, right? You know, whether it's VTA or substantia nigra, is working to perform this computation of reward amplitude and inherently the computation of reward prediction error. Okay, you'll see this is central to most models of addictive behaviors, or at least a big class of models of addictive behaviors. Okay, all right. So let's talk about the basis for a major class of models of addictive behaviors, and that is models that ask the question, what are the computational processes that go into decision making that is based on motivation, right? Or stimuli actions that have a motivational impact. And really there you have two strains of thought, okay, from my point of view, okay? You have the strain of thought that comes really from economics, and it says that the goal of behavior is to get as many toys as you can before you die, all right? Okay? You're optimal and rational if, in fact, given your patterns of behavior or potential patterns of behavior, you obtain the most rewards, okay? So maximization of delayed rewards is the golden standard for rationality, and that's what defines the power of reinforcement learning algorithms. Right? There is a different perspective, a very historically rich perspective, which basically says that the goal of whatever behavior you do is to maintain your physiological viability. And that you do through maintaining homeostasis, right? Maintaining your organismal integrity, right? And so there the optimal is to keep as close to physiological set points as possible, okay? Now, this goal leads to a whole class of models based on positive reinforcement, okay? This leads to a whole class of models that's based on negative reinforcement, right? Here you do new stuff because it allows you to get new rewards. Here you do new stuff because it allows you to counter potential deviations, or actually deviations that have happened, okay? And so let me focus on this first, and then we'll go to that second, okay? And really, to understand these models, you need to understand a few concepts, right? The first one is a concept of value, or with slight variations, it's the concept of utility in economics, right? And you know, it defines the motivational estimate, or estimate of motivational potential of stimuli, actions, state-action pairs, outcomes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anything that you see or you can do, right? Okay, the second concept that you really need to focus on is reward, okay? And the reward is not equivalent to value, right? The reward is the actual outcome, right, of what you do, right, given your specific situation, right? The outcome of what happens given that you see a stimulus, or outcome what happens when you get when you perform an action, okay? You will see so it really drives the valuation process. So whether you get positive and negative rewards is the thing that is going to allow you to learn values, okay? And it's really it's a thing that is external to the organism, but I'll talk about a caveat later. All right? So if you think about it, rewards are defined outside the organism, right? If you think about an experimental situation where you want to drive a rat to do something, right, you define what reward you will give it in order to drive the behavior, right? And you also sort of stack the cards. If you want to give it liquid, right, you deprive the animal of liquids. If you want to give it food, you deprive the animal of food. Okay? All right? And the third concept that's important is this idea of temporal discounting, which is actually key to intertemporal choice issues. And the idea is that delayed outcomes are less valued, right? It's a very natural sort of concept. You know, 10 euros today will be more valuable to you than 10 euros 20 years from now. Okay? All right? And so those three concepts together can give you an idea of how you can calculate value specifically, right? Give you a mathematical model for what is value, right? And value can be sort of mathematically defined as a sum of discounted rewards estimated as possible in the future starting from some state or an action, right? So the value at any particular time t starting from some state is just the total sum of all the expected rewards that you will get, right, in the future starting from this initial point and then discounted in time with this discounting factor gamma. Okay? All right. Okay. And of course, this estimate of the value of a particular state also depends on the action policy, meaning that this estimate will depend on where you've actually gone, right? And what you have, what rewards you have observed, okay? So the two things that you need to somehow learn how to update in order to model this value-based behavior, obviously, how do you update the values, right? And how do you structure an action policy, right? Do you learn the action policy? Do you pick it somehow statically, et cetera, et cetera? All right. Okay, and this is, in fact, this process is formalized by a whole slew of algorithmic models called the reinforcement learning algorithms. And I'll go through one in a little bit more detail and another one in sort of quickly. All right? Okay. All right. So if, you know, reinforcement learning models, right, are all about valuation, right? It's all about learning values of actions and states, okay? And the thing is that the first thing that you need to do in order to start, you know, your reinforcement learning model is to define the state space, right? You need to formally lay out what are the possible states and the actions that describe the situation you're going to model, right? You know, if you're going to do a reinforcement learning model of your behavioral experiment, that forces you to sit down and really think about what are the states and what are the actions in my behavioral experiment, right? And the states could be, I show a stimulus or not, or, you know, my rat is in the right sleeve versus the left sleeve, right? Is my rat in the, you know, so that you have to have a state for the right sleeve, a state for the left sleeve, a state for where the rat is in front of a choice, right? And the actions are explicitly also, you know, what are the actions that are possible from each state, right? Go to the left, go to the right, state, okay? All right? Then you need to define, once you've done the structure, what you're going to then define is the reward structure within your state space. You know, where am I going to provide the rewarding or reinforcing outcome to this animal? Is it when it goes here? Is it when it goes here? Is it when it goes here? Or is it going to be here with a whole sequence of actions? All right? So just doing that is potentially quite useful to pick apart the experiment that you're trying to do. Okay, so let's sort of go back and see how we can develop an algorithm by which the values for particular state action pairs could be learned. Okay, so let's just start out simply. Let's say that we start out in state S1, and there's 3 possible actions that are available, logically named A1, action 1, action 2, and action 3. Okay, all right? And we're going to say that the selection, meaning which action we're going to take, actually is going to depend on the values that we have learned that are associated with the state action pair, meaning if we're in S1, what's the value of taking A1? If we're in S2, what's the value of taking A2, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so how do you learn that? Okay, all right, let's say that we've taken action A1 and we've reached the state S2 and something happens in S2. Let's say that we get some reward. Okay, all right. So then we can calculate the reward prediction error, right, which is equivalent to the reward we get when we go from S1 through A1 to S2, okay, plus the reward that we expect, that is associated with S2. This is everything that we'll actually get in the future. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but actually it's not that complicated. Minus our expectation of what we would get if we were to perform this action, right? So this is the received reward, right? This is the expected reward, okay? All right? So if we don't expect anything and we get something, delta is going to be R1. Yes? Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to update our estimate of the value, or this Q value it's called, for state action pair 1, 1, right, by taking the old estimate and adding a term that is proportional to our difference, okay? And this alpha is a learning rate that is a free parameter in our model, okay? All right, and then we can follow starting from S2 to the next state, et cetera, right? And now start learning the value of S2 for the different actions, okay? And we can sort of go through the whole state space, right? And now what we're going to do, and essentially using this prediction error and updated estimates, what we will come up with is a whole slew of Qs, right? There's going to be a Q for each state action pair that completely describe the decision process that we expect to see in our experiment, okay? Yeah, go ahead.
We're constantly updating the value.
Yes. Okay, so what's inherent in this thing is that as you are behaving, as you're going through this, exploring your environment, you're constantly updating the Qs until the Qs begin to reflect appropriately the reward contingencies or reward schedule of your experiment, right? Because if you've learned, if you've explored enough, right, then the delta will go to 0, okay? Because at every time you visit S2, for example, your Q S1, A1 will be exactly what you get, and learning will stop, okay? So unless you change your reward contingency, and then you get a new error, and you will start updating. Okay, so for example, if you remove the reward here, where did it go? If you remove the reward here, right, delta for this action pair will be negative, right? And so the Q will decrease, and you will, potentially decrease the probability of going here. So it's sort of like extinction. In fact, it is. Well, it's a model for extinction. Okay. So now you have this algorithm for calculating what drives the learning and calculating how the learning of values is actually done. And now you're going to take these values and they're going to drive action selection, right? Which action you actually select, let's say starting here or starting here, okay? And so this action selection is now done by a softmax equation, right? Notice it's sort of like what you've seen before, right? And that is probability of taking an action A, given that you are starting in state S, ATST, right, is equal essentially to the quotient between a term that is proportional to the value of the state action pair, right? And all the other potential, and the values of all the other potential choices you can make starting from the state where you start. Okay? All right? Okay. And then this beta parameter is the so-called temperature parameter. And as beta goes to 1, your action selection becomes greedy, meaning that you, with 100% probability, pick the action that has the higher value, right? And as beta goes towards 0, your action selection becomes more explorative, meaning that you start taking random choices, right? Might be still biased towards the action that has the higher value, but it allows you a probability of taking the actions that you expect to be less rewarding. If beta is 0, this probability is exactly half, right? If beta is 0, you're half-half. You're totally random, okay? So the parameters that you have in these reinforcement learning models are something like the beta, the learning rate, okay, and then what I don't show here, but also the discounting factor, okay? All right, so these are the internal parameters. And the R's and the S's and the A's are the things that you impose on the animal or impose on the subject. Okay? All right. And so, you know, this is a kind of an old slide that was there. So, and the relevance to the brain of this computation is, of course, found in the dopaminergic nuclei that are in the midbrain, right? And this error is computed by the dopamine neurons, or at least this is the data that supports that view. More recently, this view has become controversial. It probably has always been controversial in the neuroscience, in the systems neuroscience community. Now it has become also controversial in the computational neuroscience community. And so really there are questions whether this is the only computation that is performed in the ventral tegmental area, for example. Okay, but at least we can take it at face value and see where it gets us. Okay, all right. And in fact, the idea is that this error is signaled from the midbrain to the striatum. It's somehow in this striatocortical loop that the values are learned and encoded. Okay, all right. Now notice that you know, what you can say is that in order for the animal to perform anything, to behave, right, in our sort of worldview, is that it doesn't really need to know explicitly what is the structure of the world, right? The only thing it needs to know is that if I am in state ST, you know, the value of action AT is this, and that's what is going to drive my behavior, right? So in this kind of a model-free reinforcement learning algorithm, the animal does not encode explicitly, you know, structure of its outcomes. Okay, there's a slight variation on this that also suggests that in addition to the Q values, you also learn transition probabilities, which means that you learn the structure of your environment, and the two processes play together to actually drive the action selection. But that's a little beyond this course. Okay, so this specific algorithm for value-based decision-making is called Q-learning because you learn state and action pairs, right? So the state where you are and the state where you end, right, is sort of inherently stuck together with the action you're going to take, right? But you could, in fact, propose that there is one process that estimates the values associated with states, okay, and another process that actually uses those values to drive actions, okay? And this group of reinforcement learning algorithms is called the actor-critic models, right? And there, what you say is that explicitly, as I told you, there are two mechanisms, right? Or two components. One component uses the reward prediction error to learn values associated with specific states, right? Because it's when you're in a specific state that you get the reward, right? Okay? You know, the reason why an action leads to a rewarding outcome is that action takes you to a rewarding state, okay? All right? And then there is an actor part, which in fact tracks these pies, or the weights associated with specific actions or action policies, okay? All right? And then the neat thing is that if you update both the values associated with the states and the action policies by the delta, the reward prediction error, you get coherent and optimal behavior, okay? All right, so the same thing that you could do with a Q-learning, you can do with an actor-critic, more or less. The nice thing about the actor-critic model is that you can map it, and this is what Yael Niv has done a lot of her work about, and Nathaniel Daw and all those guys, is that you can map the critic function to specifics and the actor function to specific parts of the dopaminergic machinery in the brain, right? So that the critic that calculates values for the states independent of actions, okay? So it's like Pavlovian values. You know, I see a light, I salivate. Salivation is not a chosen action, it's just something that happens, okay? All right? That's in the ventral striatum, okay? And the actor that actually selects voluntary actions is in the dorsal striatum, okay? And both of them are driven by the error signals emanating from the VTA/SNC amalgam. All right, okay. Okay, all right, so now what we've seen so far is that, you know, you can have a very simple set of algorithmic models, right, that allow you to understand, or at least start to model, how an animal or anyone would make decisions about what to do, right, based on where they are and what sort of rewards one expects to get, okay? And really, this is, you know, directly relevant to addiction, right? Because addiction is really something that goes wrong, or let me put it slightly differently, more politically correct, something that goes different about the decisions that we make, right, when the outcome of those decisions is a delivery of an addictive substance, right? And if you think about it, you know, development of addiction is all about making these decisions, you know, to seek the drug, to take the drug, to choose the drug over other rewards, to keep on, you know, choosing the drug even though you're punished, you know, to choose the drug even if they don't make you high anymore, right? All of these questions that, you know, that happen in human addicts, you know, we've seen during the previous lectures, are, you know, are in fact, you know, the attempt is to model them with specific behavioral paradigms and to pick that apart again, okay? And so, right, so let me skip that. We all know the definition of addiction. I probably got it wrong. But, you know, one can ask the question, what goes wrong as our organism becomes addicted, you know? Is it that something is screwed up in the positive reinforcement contingencies in this environment because it is exposed to the drug, you know, either contingent or non-contingent manner? You know, does something go wrong with this intertemporal choice? You know, are you more focused on immediate rewards than on delayed rewards? Okay. is something, you know, is there erroneous inelasticity of choice? You know, is there erroneous lack of cognitive control, meaning that, you know, you can't help myself, I can't help myself. One can't help oneself not to do things that one knows are not supposed to be done, okay? All right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or erroneous prevalence of negative reinforcement. And, you know, vast majority of computational models that are being applied now are being developed for addiction really are asking questions of, you know, which of these pathologies could be sufficient to explain various aspects of addictive-like behavior, okay? All right, and that's what I'm going to try to go through. Okay, let's see, what's the next thing? Yeah, the challenge is to understand what process and mechanism leads to these erroneous things, okay? This is kind of a vacuous statement because this is not specific to computational modeling, right? We would all agree on that. Okay, so any questions so far about the previous stuff? Okay, all right, let me go on. Okay, so let me give you kind of a layout. Yes?
About the method that you recorded.
Yeah, there is some evidence that you could see that in non-invasive measurements. Now, EEG is a little bit complicated because it's not easy to define what goes up, what goes down in EEG signals. You know, in fMRI, I'm not a specialist in fMRI. Where's Nellie? She's over there. I vaguely remember reading papers where they, you know, claimed that they could see increases and decreases in activity in the appropriate cortical areas that are consistent with accumulation of evidence. Okay, let me put it this way. Is that guarded enough for you? You know? Okay. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. That's an excellent issue, but that's an issue about recording methods. And that's an issue about what you're actually measuring when you're doing non-invasive, you know, measurements. And it's wonderful. Let's talk about this while we're drinking wine this evening, because it's otherwise I'll keep on babbling and then we'll not go to the beach.
Yes, Aaron. So one of the criticisms that I've sort of seen in the literature with respect to reinforcement learning as like a model of brain function is that so it's an iterative process that results in learning very gradually over time.
Yes, right? It's slow.
With animal behavior, you can oftentimes see very steep changes in their behavior to a predicted reward. So has this been reconciled at all, or is there a way to reconcile it?
It's being reconciled. I mean, I'll hopefully we'll get maybe to one proposal how you could reconcile that, okay? Now, for example, I'm not going to talk explicitly about this, but let me just say 2 words about it, right? So, Ken Berridge and Terry Robinson, for example, they have a theory they call incentive sensitization, right? And there was a lively polemic between them and Peter Dayan and Nathaniel Daw, who have cut their teeth on making reinforcement learning models for behavior. What exactly is this incentive sensitization, and what is this, you know, incentive that you learn? Okay, so now one can say that the incentives are somehow equivalent to values. Okay, now. Berridge and Robinson found that direct analogy not particularly to their liking or wanting, I don't know which one, you know, because that doesn't explain the sort of fast alterations of animal responding to stimuli, right? And so they published a model, I think Berridge published a model, Berridge and his postdoc or a student published a model in PLOS Computational Biology, where they explicitly put in what they mean algorithmically by incentive sensitization, all right? And I just didn't have time. I thought I don't have time to talk about it. But basically what they did, and let me just go back for a sec, okay? What they did is they said that this raw value is not the thing that drives the behavior, more or less. What drives the behavior, meaning what drives action selection, is this learned value times a parameter, right, that is proportional to something about the internal state of the animal. Okay? All right? And when the internal state of the animal is such that, let's say it's deprived, this parameter would be high. And when it's satiated, this parameter would be low. Okay? And that will scale these action values, for example, right on the spot like that. Okay? And so that, let's say that you have an animal that is food deprived with a little bit, and then you give it a big chunk of food, right? And it consumes it, and it no longer wants to do the behavior. Okay? That, you could say, oh, that's fast learning, right? But in some sense, it's not learning, it's modulation of behavior based on the internal state. So that's one of the approaches. So let me see if I can get to it. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Perhaps it is stupid from your point.
There are no stupid questions. Okay.
I just wondering, is it possible to have a dynamic algorithm to be able to, whenever is something put in the system and then it has some kind of, state when it's learned to be changed in some manner,
Yeah, let me try to get at that. Okay? Let me try to get at that. All right. Okay. All right. So let's go through really quickly through the models. So there's a whole history of economic models of addiction, right? Where addiction is viewed as a kind of a consumer behavior. And the questions that are being asked there is how does they're non-neural models. They're not even asking if the brain has any role in it. It's just a microeconomic consumer behavior model, which basically says you take the only thing that matters about you taking or seeking the drug is the return versus cost. Okay, if it costs a lot to take the drug, you don't do it, right? If it costs less to take the drug, meaning cost in all sorts of general sense, monetary cost, societal cost, you do it, okay? Right, the other line of the reasoning is focused on rationality of choice, meaning can your drug-seeking choice still be viewed as maximizing rewards available, right? Sniff of Coke has a big reward, makes you feel good, so you should choose it, and has a big value, so it's totally rational that you will choose it, right? And also within this rationality that maybe what goes wrong, and there's a whole strain of models and reasoning, particularly from Warren Bickel, that says that what goes wrong in addicts is they have a discounting function that's too fast, right? So they're completely impulsive because they choose the immediate reward versus delayed reward, right? And they're compulsive because they discount the delayed punishment too much, so they don't care about it, okay? All right, but I'm not going to talk about those. I know it's kind of bad presentation style to not talk about stuff you don't talk, but I felt it was important to mention them, okay? So what I'll talk about are positive reinforcement models of addiction, so at least give you an example of one or two, and then show you an example of negative reinforcement models, okay? And then, the last bit, hopefully we'll get to it, is a circuit model of addictive drug action, mostly nicotine. Okay, so let's go to this, let me skip that, okay? So let's go to this first class of models, this positive reinforcement models, right? It is everything I will say today is a reductionist approach, focused on one particular aspect of how addictive drugs change biology in the brain, right? And it just happens to be that this aspect is dopamine signaling. Okay, so we all, as I've told you before, but I'll repeat it again, let's say that we assume that phasic dopamine represents reward error, as you see here. Up, it's learned away. Here it's emitted. Okay, so normal errors are learned away, meaning that by the time you've visited every state enough, you know what to expect in every state. You no longer have this learning signal transmitted by the dopaminergic circuitry. Now, what happens for, and this is a lot, I should say that this model I'm going to talk about has been a very influential model that was published by David Reddish in 2004, and that has, I think, affected a lot how people in the addiction field think about the onset of addictive behaviors or the onset of self-administration. Now, the assumption that you make for this model to work is that unlike natural rewards, this phasic dopamine signal does not go away even after you've learned to expect the cocaine delivery. Why doesn't it go away? Because cocaine acts directly pharmacologically on the dopaminergic circuitry to make well, actually, the slide is wrong in some sense, because if we're talking about cocaine, it doesn't make the cells fire more per se, but the most direct effect is, of course, a reduction in dopamine reuptake. And so what doesn't go away is the impact of the effective impact of the signal in the structures that receive dopaminergic inputs. Okay, all right. So the point is that because this phasic dopamine signal never goes away, what happens is that for the cocaine choice, you have an excessive reward prediction error that is always there. Okay, all right. Now here's a little picture or figure that I stole from one of papers from Paul Phillips, basically showing that on cocaine delivery in cocaine-trained rats, you have dopamine outflow in, I think it was in the nucleus accumbens that he showed. Okay, all right. So, showing these experimental slides, I'm forever paranoid in this audience that, I'm just gonna, yes?
So the way you display it, it would be a reward signal that is there for a very brief period of time.
Yes.
And so that means it's overvaluing natural rewards, because the pharmacological action is much longer.
Right, okay, so I'm going to talk about this model, okay? And specifically what this model can sort of give you, right? You're correct. There is no role for tonic changes of dopamine in this particular model. Yeah. Okay, so that's a you can say a failure of this model or a process that it does not address.
Even if it's not tonic, but sustained.
Firing, right? Sustained burst firing, presumably results in persistent increases of dopamine concentration at the target areas. Well, it's not within the purview of this model. Okay, so let's see how much we can explain and what we don't get right with this model. Okay, all right. So, so if you have this excessive TD error, then for the cocaine choice, learning never stops. For the natural choice, learning will stop when you've learned the values. Okay? All right? So here it is. Here is this model, right? It falls into this temporal difference reinforcement learning algorithms. Okay, so what you want to learn is a value of a particular state. Okay? You learn that by looking at this error. Right, in this update equation, right? When you have matched the reward that you received with the reward that you expect, this goes to 0, everything is stable, okay? All right? Now, what David Reddish suggested is that cocaine pharmacologically, evokes a persistent error signal. So now this delta equation, right, is slightly modified. So now a delta equals a maximum of the old equation that basically tells you how to compute reward prediction error for natural rewards as well as for cocaine, and the pharmacological effect of cocaine, right? So formally, this will give you, this equation will give you an outcome, an error that goes away for natural rewards, okay, right? But is always ds for the cocaine reward, for the cocaine delivery, okay? All right? So, and as long as d of s is bigger than 0, this error will always be positive. Yeah? Okay. All right. So here's a simulation of that, okay, from the science paper. Okay. So what you see is that for natural rewards, and this is the number of received rewards, and this is the state space of this very simple simulation, right? So the state space, this is a very simple task, okay? You start in some state, okay? And then you transition to another state where you receive reward. And then there's a timeout and a delay, okay? All right, so this would be simulation of, this linear track paradigm, right? You start at the beginning, you run to the end, you get injected with something, or you get a lick, okay? So for the natural rewards, what you see is that this error goes down to 0 by the time you get 100th trial or 100th reward, right? Okay. This is so the red and the blue are actually the error signals that you get at different points within the state space. So this one is the entry into the state that gives you the reward, and this is entry into the state where the reward is potentially available, right? So what you see is this error goes down, this error kind of levels out. Okay, so you would expect no dopamine transient signal here and dopamine transient signals that occur here, right? Just like you saw in this recording where the transient dopamine transferred from the reward to the CS that predicts the reward, right? And in this setup, in this setup, it's the S0 that predicts the availability of reward, okay? Now, for the drug choice, okay, if instead of natural reward, what you got here was a shot of cocaine, right? This error associated with S1 never goes to 0, okay? And the error that is signaled at S0 keeps going up, okay? All right, I'll leave it to you as an exercise for this evening to see that delta at S0 actually signals the value expected for S0, okay? So this guy levels out, this guy keeps going up and up and up and up and up, right? So now what happens is that if you were to modify the state space into having this choice or this choice, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or even a mathematician, right, to figure out that you're going to choose this over that, no matter what else happens eventually. Okay, so that was the whole point of David's suggestion, right? Because of the pharmacological action of cocaine, right, cocaine choice will always win because it has always the biggest value eventually, no matter how good the natural reward might be. Okay, so
the relative, so the y-axis, what is exactly your y-axis? So it's the prediction error signal.
Yes, it's the prediction error signal.
But so in the chronic situation after hundreds of rewards,
yeah,
this prediction error signal is still much smaller than what you have initially. So it's relative, because I mean you start at 0.25.
Yeah. So okay. So let's say that you start at some expectation of reward, some random expectation of reward. Okay. All right. And then the dynamics of the error signal are such that, as you match your expectation to actually what happens, right, the error will go down. So even for the drug reward, the error will go down, right?
But the blue line never goes very high. I think that's
Here the point.
Yeah,
the
so
blue
I'm
line
sort
here
of
never goes
surprised,
very
you know,
high.
you really have to squint to see
Because in
that the
reality-
blue line on the right side is a little higher than on the left side.
in reality, the QC
That
level is always.
yeah, that depends on how many simulations you run, okay?
Yeah, but I mean 300, this is many doses of cocaine.
Yes, that's true, right? It's
And
suggested,
so, I mean, the difference is barely visible, no?
well,
In the blue.
eventually it'll be different.
And why are the traces so thick?
I did not review this paper for Science, okay?
Okay.
In the original figure, the traces are not that thick. Okay. All right. Okay, so let me go through some other parts of this model. So now you have let's say that you have a task where you can choose the natural reward or choose the drug. Okay, so now your state space reflects this choice structure. Okay, so we know that for the drug, this error never goes away. So the value for the cocaine choice will tend to infinity. Okay? The value for the food choice will tend to some finite number that reflects the rewarding impact of the food that you consume. Okay? Now, infinity is always bigger than any finite number, no matter how big, right? So, which means that as time goes to infinity, which is fine for mathematicians, right, the choice for the drug goes to 1. Okay? All right. In fact, the choice for the drug will go to 1, even if your temperature parameter is such that the decisions are very soft initially. Right? Okay, because remember the decisions in the softmax, right, is the ratio between, the value for this choice, the value for this choice, the ratio between the value for this choice, right, and the sum of all the other values. Yeah? If one value goes to infinity, then you get infinity over infinity, which is formally defined to be 1. Yeah.
So a food reward, when you go to a restaurant,
Yeah.
where the cook is cooking every day a bit better than you would have expected,
Yeah.
then you would see the same as when they picked the drug.
In this model, yeah. Okay? In this model, yeah. So you would get addicted to that restaurant. Okay? So
Well, there is a human pathology of
yeah, you know.
gourmand syndrome, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So then you can actually discuss whether that's a pessimistic or overly pessimistic or overly optimistic personality. But anyway, but let's go back to this. So in the long run, the model always chooses the drug, okay, no matter what else happens, right? No matter what other new natural rewards appear in the world, the model will always choose the drug eventually, okay? So just to give you a schematic, so in here, the value for the food levels out, the value for the drug goes to infinity. You know, eventually, the value for the drug is bigger than the value of the food, no matter what that is. And Christian, and the number of trials that it takes depends on this learning rate parameter. Okay? And it's kind of not too trivial to choose it correctly, even theoretically, right? Because if you choose it too high, you start getting erratic behaviors. You never visit appropriately the rewarded states, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the drug always wins, all right? Okay, so we're done, right? We've solved addiction.
So is that model, so if the drug initially has an aversive component, which for example is the case with nicotine, that in the beginning at least is not very pleasant.
Right.
That can also explain that switch, right? You would have to.
Yeah, you would have to change the model a bit, but for example, if you imagine that the aversive components of nicotine are somehow related to its peripheral effects, non-neural effects, but the neural effect of nicotine, as I will maybe show if I get to it, is actually to drive the dopamine neurons, then your initial disliking of nicotine is pithed against the initial wanting of nicotine, which develops to overcome the disliking, And then, you know, the question is with drug like nicotine, sorry, let me just finish and then you can, is, you know, does the disliking go away because your body has adapted to nicotine? You know, just physiological adaptation at some level? Or is it that you've learned away that disliking in the sense that, you know, the adaptations are there or not, but you've learned that the nicotine is, you know, sort of mildly euphorogenic, and so, you know, who cares, right, in some sense. This certainly may be true for alcohol, right? You know, we all know that if you drink a bit too much, and some of us know how much too much is for the person, you will feel bad once the euphorogenic effect of alcohol wears off, but that doesn't stop us from over-consuming sometimes, right? So something has happened. Yeah.
And conversely, it would also compatible with the observation that when given a choice acutely, an animal may actually prefer sucrose over cocaine.
That's not compatible with this model.
It's not?
No, because sucrose is a natural reward.
Yeah.
So by the time you learn how good, you know, how motivationally good for you is a particular dose of sucrose, right? That value for the sucrose will level out.
No,
the value of cocaine will.
But it would be the very initial.
Oh, the very initial, yeah.
That would be.
Yeah, right. So you should
it's
see.
Not so surprising.
Right. So
that with natural reward, sometimes you have a preference of the natural reward over the addictive reward. That doesn't show that sucrose is more addictive than cocaine.
But there is a clear prediction from this model, is that sort of preference for natural reward over the drug, right, should happen only in animals that are naive to the drug. It should not happen to animals that have experienced the drug in the long term. Okay? So, all right, I haven't even finished explaining this model, but we're already poking holes in it, right? Okay? All right? But that's an important role for computational models, right? You can poke holes in them. And in fact, I would venture to say that computational models are most useful when they're wrong, because you can say exactly why they're wrong, right? And go out after that. Okay, so let me sort of go, so here's the kind of a summary of the results. And that is, if you let our model experience the drug, right, then the choice for the contrasting choice for choosing the drug versus the natural reward goes towards 1, okay? If the natural reward is very, very rewarding, okay, meaning that it's high, so it's almost equal somehow to the pharmacological reward action of the drug, that probability will be lower, right? Meaning that you might choose the natural reward versus the drug. But as you experience the drug more and more, that sort of competition between natural reward and the drug decreases, okay? At the same time, if you now have an experiment where you pair the drug reward with a cost, like a punishment, right? You can ask, how sensitive is the choice for the drug to the amount of the cost, okay? And what you find is that in this model, you know, correctly, natural rewards are elastic to the cost. Oops. Right? So you're sort of reflecting this idea of economic cost-benefit sensitivity. But for the drug, this elasticity is much reduced or significantly reduced. Okay? So the drug choice becomes inelastic to cost. All right? So then this is sort of like compulsivity of choice. All right? All right? But notice that it still goes down, which predicts that the drug is still, choice is still elastic to cost. Right? So all behavior is still controlled by the values. Right? So all drug-taking behavior here is still fundamentally under motivational control. Right? Value-based control. Okay? All right? So to summarize this, How am I doing? Is it break time? Is it not break time?
Would be a good moment, I guess.
Let me just summarize and we take a break, okay? All right? So to summarize this, you know, there are the good and the bad parts of this model, okay? It accounts for acquisition of drug associated behavior based on the pharmacological action of the drug on the dopamine circuitry, okay? Gives you a long-term increase in probability of choice, resistance to cost for drugs, right? And it really makes a very simple and perhaps oversimplified, but it makes a direct link between the biology of drug action in some very summarized way, like a caricature way, and the behavior that results from those biological effects. Now, there are a bunch of problems, of course, right? Outside the purview of this model is withdrawal, okay? It doesn't give you a specific mechanism by how actually, you know, the drug does what it do, right? Do what it does, okay? It cannot give you timescales for the drug consumption, actually. It can't model the pattern of drug taking within a session, all right? Most importantly, it predicts that you should never have blocking with drugs because learning continues, but blocking differentially with natural rewards. And this has been shown to be wrong. You get blocking with drugs. Sometimes. Okay, all right, but you can, all right? So there's been an argument between the authors of that bad paper and David Reddish, okay? All right? So the dopamine signal is always there. That's been questioned. There is some data that indicates that may not be necessarily the case and may not be necessarily the case for all drug-associated behavioral situations or all drugs, okay? All right? Drug taking always wins, right? No matter what else happens. This has been questioned also. Particularly, there was an experiment done by Serge Ahmed where he took his escalated rats, and then gave them a choice of saccharose, I think, instead of just saline.
Well, both. So the artificial sweetener and an actual.
Yeah, and then these escalated rats, they're supposed to be like hyper addicted, right? They just titrated down their drug taking to what you would consider like, you know, recreational cocaine use, right? Once in a while. Okay, so something is not quite captured in this model, right? And then the kind of a troubling thing from an implementational side is the values associated with the drug cost go to infinity. And then you have to ask yourself a question. How can you represent infinity by a neural signal? Okay. All right, so let's take a 10-minute break, and I'll sort of try to go through other models.